Every self-help book will tell you that billionaires wake up at 5 a.m. They meditate, they journal, they cold plunge, they drink celery juice and read for an hour before the sun rises. And if you just copy that routine, you'll be rich too. But here's the thing nobody is saying out loud. That's not the routine. That's the performance of the routine, the part they show on Instagram, the part that makes for a good interview answer. What actually happens in the first 90 minutes of a billionaire's morning, the cognitive sequence, the mental architecture, the invisible decisions being made before breakfast, that's a completely different story. And that's what this video is about. What you're about to hear isn't motivation. It's not a productivity hack list. It's a psychological breakdown of the morning behaviors that ultra-wealthy individuals actually practice, behaviors rooted in cognitive science, behavioral economics, and decision theory. Some of it will feel uncomfortable. Some of it will contradict everything you've read. And a few things will make you look at your own morning and realize you've been optimizing the wrong thing entirely. We're going to talk about how Warren Buffett uses his mornings to engineer a specific cognitive state, not energy, not focus, but something far more valuable. We're going to look at why Elon Musk's chaotic-looking morning is actually a precise psychological tool. We'll examine how Jeff Bezos built a morning framework around a single decision, science concept that most people have never heard of. And we'll go deep on one psychological principle, one that explains almost everything about why rich people think differently from the moment they open their eyes. This isn't about copying someone's alarm time. This is about understanding the mental operating system running underneath the routine. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Let's start somewhere unexpected. In 1974, a psychologist named Walter Mischel published findings from what would become one of the most referenced studies in behavioral science. You probably know it as the marshmallow experiment. A child is left alone in a room with one marshmallow and told Z, if you wait 15 minutes without eating it, you'll get 2. The popular interpretation was always about willpower, about delaying gratification. But that's the shallow read. The deeper finding, the one that got buried under decades of self-help oversimplification, was about environment design. The children who waited longest weren't necessarily the ones with the strongest willpower. They were the ones who restructured their environment. They looked away from the marshmallow. They sang songs. They created physical and psychological distance between themselves and the temptation. They didn't rely on discipline. They engineered the conditions for a better decision. Billionaires do this with their mornings, not consciously in every case, but the pattern is consistent enough to be undeniable. Warren Buffett is famous for sleeping in. His morning begins late by Silicon Valley standards. No 4:30 a.m. alarm, no pre-dawn workout ritual. And for years, business journalists treated this as a quirk, an old man's habit. What they missed entirely is what Buffett is actually doing. He once described his ideal morning as beginning with reading. Not emails, not headlines, not a to-do list. Reading. Long form, deep, slow reading for 3 to 4 hours before he engages with any human being or any decision that requires his output. When asked why, he gave a deceptively simple answer. He said he was marinating. Psychologists have a more technical term for what Buffett is doing. It's called incubation. The incubation effect is a well-documented phenomenon in cognitive science where the brain continues processing complex problems during periods of unrelated mental activity. When you step away from a problem and engage in low-demand cognitive tasks, like reading something familiar, taking a walk, or doing routine physical activity, your default mode network activates. This is the part of your brain responsible for creative insight, pattern recognition, and long-range planning. It works best when it isn't being consciously directed. Buffett's morning reading isn't about information consumption. It's about activating the incubation state before his decision-making work begins. By the time he's ready to look at a business proposal or an investment thesis, his brain has already been running background processes for hours. He's not starting cold, he's starting warm. And in the world of high-stakes financial decisions, that cognitive warmth is worth billions. The insight here isn't read more in the morning. The insight is this: the most successful people in the world treat their morning as a cognitive warm-up, not a productivity sprint. They're preparing the mind, not filling the schedule. But here's where it gets interesting. While Buffett is engineering slow cognitive activation, on the other side of the behavioral spectrum, you have someone like Elon Musk, who by most accounts starts his morning in a state that looks like controlled chaos. Emails, texts, urgent engineering problems from the night before. No meditation, no journaling, no gradual easing into the day, just immediate full immersion into complexity. To most productivity coaches, this looks like a disaster, and if you tried it, it probably would be. But here's what the behavioral science actually says about people with extremely high tolerance for cognitive load, which Musk, by any measure, has. There's a concept in psychology called arousal optimization, which comes from the Yerkes-Dodson law. The basic principle is that performance peaks at a specific level of mental arousal, not too low, not too high. But that optimal level isn't the same for everyone. For individuals who have trained themselves to operate in high complexity environments, fighter pilots, trauma surgeons, elite traders, the performance peak sits at a much higher arousal level than it does for an average person. They actually think worse in calm, understimulating environments. Musk's chaotic morning isn't disorder. It's a calibrated arousal environment designed for someone whose brain performs best under intense cognitive pressure. He's not ignoring self-care. He's using a different optimization function, one that most people's nervous systems simply aren't built for. The danger is in the imitation. Someone who hasn't trained their system to tolerate that level of stimulus will experience it as pure stress, which degrades decision quality dramatically. The deeper pattern here is something worth sitting with. Buffett and Musk appear to have completely opposite mornings. One is slow, one is fast. One is quiet, one is electric. But they share one critical underlying behavior. Both of them have spent decades learning exactly what cognitive state they need to be in before making important decisions, and they engineer their mornings specifically to reach that state. That's the invisible behavior. That's what nobody talks about. Most people spend their morning reacting. Billionaires spend their morning manufacturing a specific internal environment. Now let's talk about Jeff Bezos, because his morning behavior reveals a psychological principle that is frankly underrated in every conversation about decision making. Bezos has spoken in interviews about what he calls his high IQ meetings window. He refuses to schedule any meeting that requires his judgment or decision making before 10 a.m. He also has what he describes as a rule about big decisions. He won't make any consequential decision after 5 p.m. His reasoning on the surface seems simple. He says he'd rather make 3 good decisions a day than 10 rushed ones. But the cognitive science behind why this works is far more interesting than the productivity framing suggests. This connects directly to a phenomenon called decision fatigue, and it's one of the most powerful and least discussed forces shaping your life without your awareness. Here's the deep dive. Decision fatigue was formerly studied by social psychologist Roy Baumeister and later popularized through research on judges, doctors, and military officers. The core finding is deceptively simple, but has enormous implications. Every decision you make, regardless of how small or large, depletes a finite cognitive resource. After enough decisions, the quality of your thinking degrades. Not dramatically, not in a way you'd obviously notice, but measurably, consistently, and dangerously. The research on Israeli judges is particularly striking. A study found that parole decisions made at the start of the day resulted in favorable outcomes roughly 65% of the time. By the end of the day, that number dropped to nearly 0. The judges weren't consciously choosing to be harsher. Their brains were defaulting to the easiest decision, which in the context of a parole hearing is always deny. When your cognitive resources are depleted, your brain conserves energy by defaulting to the status quo, by saying no, by choosing inaction. Now think about what this means for a billionaire making capital allocation decisions, or a founder deciding whether to enter a new market, or an investor evaluating a deal. If those decisions are happening at the end of a day full of meetings, emails, and minor operational choices, the brain making those calls is not the same brain that showed up that morning. It's a depleted conservation mode brain. And a conservation mode brain doesn't build empires. Bezos understood this, whether through formal study or intuitive pattern recognition, and built his morning architecture around protecting the brain's peak decision-making window. His mornings are deliberately low stimulus. He eats breakfast with his family. He reads the newspaper. He doesn't look at email before a certain time. He has called this his puttering time. It sounds indulgent. It is, in fact, strategic. But most people miss this part. Decision fatigue management isn't just about when you make decisions. It's about what kinds of cognitive demands you expose yourself to in the hours before your most important thinking needs to happen. Every scroll through social media in the first 30 minutes of your morning is a small withdrawal from your decision quality bank. Every petty email responded to before 9 a.m. is costing you something on the other end of the day. Not in a catastrophic way, in the slow, invisible way that compounds over months and years into a massive performance gap between you and someone who understood the math. Bezos protects his morning not because he's lazy or privileged. He protects it because he knows exactly how expensive mental degradation is at his scale. There is another dimension to billionaire mornings that almost never gets discussed, and it has less to do with productivity and more to do with identity. Specifically, with a psychological phenomenon called identity consistent behavior. Carol Dweck's research on self-concept and behavior showed that people don't just act based on goals or incentives. They act in ways consistent with who they believe themselves to be. The self-concept acts as a powerful behavioral regulator. When your actions align with your identity, they feel effortless. When they don't, they require willpower, which, as we've just established, is a depletable resource. Here's what this looks like in practice. Charlie Munger, Warren Buffett's longtime business partner, once described his morning in a way that most people dismissed as modesty. He said he simply spends the first part of every morning trying to become slightly less stupid than he was the day before. That's not a productivity goal. That's an identity statement. Munger doesn't think of himself as a businessman who also reads. He thinks of himself as a learning machine who also happens to run a business. The reading happens automatically because it's not effortful discipline, it's identity expression. Ray Dalio, founder of Bridgewater Associates and an architect of some of the most rigorous investment frameworks in history, meditates every morning, not for stress relief, but for what he describes as accessing a different mode of thinking. He's written about how transcendental meditation gave him the ability to observe his own thoughts without being captured by them. In the language of cognitive science, this is called metacognition, the ability to think about your own thinking. And it is, empirically, one of the clearest cognitive differentiators between high-performing decision makers and average ones. The reason metacognition matters in the morning specifically is that the first thoughts you have when you wake up tend to be emotionally loaded. Anxiety about the day, rumination about yesterday, anticipatory stress about upcoming challenges. Without a metacognitive practice of some kind, whether that's meditation, journaling, a slow walk, or even just quiet coffee with no phone, those emotional states bleed directly into your early morning decision making. You're not thinking about the problem in front of you. You're thinking through an emotional filter you haven't even noticed is there. Dalio's meditation practice isn't spiritual theater. It's a daily cognitive reset that clears the emotional residue from his thinking before his thinking is needed for anything important. The version most people do instead is reach for their phone the moment they open their eyes, which immediately loads their emotional state with comparison, news, stress, and social feedback loops. And then they wonder why their thinking feels foggy before noon. There's a pattern beginning to emerge here. And if you've been paying attention, you've probably already sensed it. But let's make it explicit because the next layer is where it gets genuinely counterintuitive. Most people believe that the purpose of a morning routine is to maximize output. More productivity, more energy, more focus, more tasks completed. Every productivity influencer on the internet frames the morning as the runway for your day's performance. But the billionaires we've studied so far, Buffett, Bezos, Munger, Dalio, aren't treating their morning as a runway for output. They're treating it as a runway for quality of thought. That distinction is enormous because if your goal is output, you fill the morning with activity. You answer emails, you review dashboards, you schedule calls, you optimize your task list. But if your goal is quality of thought, you do almost the opposite. You reduce friction, you protect silence, you engage in low-demand cognitive activities that allow your neural networks to settle into their highest function state before you ask them to do real work. The reason this matters, and this is the uncomfortable part, is that most people will never prioritize quality of thought over visible productivity because quality of thought is invisible. You can't screenshot it. You can't show it on a performance review. You can't prove to anyone that the 90 minutes you spent reading, thinking, and doing nothing this morning was actually the most valuable part of your day. But the compounding effect of high-quality thinking, made every day over years and decades, is precisely the gap between good performance and generational wealth. It's not the hustle, it's the depth. Now here's something almost nobody talks about, something that sits at the intersection of behavioral economics and neuroscience and changes how you understand everything we've discussed. There's a concept called implementation intentions developed by psychologist Peter Gollwitzer. The basic finding is that people are dramatically more likely to follow through on a behavior when they pre-commit to the specific when, where, and how of that behavior, not just the what. I will meditate in the morning produces far weaker results than I will meditate at 7:15 a.m. sitting in the chair by the window for 12 minutes immediately after making coffee. The specificity is the mechanism. The brain encodes the behavior as an automatic response to a specific contextual trigger, which removes the need for willpower entirely. Every billionaire we've discussed has morning environments with extraordinarily high specificity. Buffett reads in the same chair. Bezos has the same breakfast. Dalio meditates at the same time. This isn't obsessive rigidity. It's behavioral architecture. By removing variability from the conditions of their morning behaviors, they've converted those behaviors from choices into automatic responses. And automatic responses don't deplete decision-making capacity. They operate on a completely different cognitive pathway. Compare that to the average person's morning, which is a series of micro decisions. Should I check my phone now or later? Should I shower before or after coffee? Should I skip the gym today? Should I eat or wait until later? Each of these feels minor, but each one draws down the same finite resource that later needs to make something important. By the time an average person reaches their desk, they've already spent a meaningful portion of their daily cognitive budget on decisions that produced nothing of value. Billionaires don't have better mornings because they're more disciplined. They have better mornings because they've engineered a system where discipline is almost never required. The environment does the work. The trigger fires the behavior. The decision is already made. Let's go somewhere else entirely for a moment because there's one more morning behavior pattern that connects all of this together, and it involves a figure who doesn't often appear in these conversations. Sarah Blakely, founder of Spanx, became the youngest self-made female billionaire in history. Her morning behavior is unusual in a way that psychologists would find fascinating. She has described spending time each morning deliberately accessing a state she calls the before. The mental and emotional state she was in as a child, curious, unfiltered, unencumbered by social judgment, willing to try things that seemed absurd because she didn't yet know they were supposed to be hard. This is not as mystical as it sounds. There is a well-documented cognitive phenomenon called the beginner's mind effect, studied extensively in creativity research. Experts in any domain tend to develop what psychologists call functional fixedness, an inability to see problems outside the frameworks their expertise has trained them to use. Children and novices don't have this limitation. They haven't been conditioned to see what's possible and what isn't. Their solutions are often absurd, but occasionally they're revolutionary. Blakely's morning practice is essentially a daily attempt to bypass expert bias in herself. Before she thinks about business strategy, before she consults her mental models and frameworks, she tries to access a thinking state where the rules are temporarily suspended, where the obvious answer isn't obvious yet. And from that state, she asks questions about her business. The psychological principle underlying this is called cognitive diffusion, a concept from acceptance and commitment therapy that involves creating distance between yourself and your habitual thought patterns. When you're fused with your thoughts, you see through them. When you're diffused from them, you can see them. You can evaluate them. You can choose whether to act on them or generate alternatives. Every truly creative business decision Blakely made, from the original product idea to the marketing strategy to the company culture, came from a thinking state that most executives never access because they're too busy being expert, too busy applying existing frameworks to new problems, too busy thinking like a business person. Her morning practice kept that beginner's channel open, and that channel was worth billions. What we've been building toward throughout this entire video is a single, unified insight, and it's this. Billionaires don't have morning routines. They have morning philosophies. A routine is a sequence of actions. A philosophy is a coherent understanding of what those actions are for. Buffett's long reading session, Bezos' protected breakfast, Munger's daily learning ritual, Dalio's meditation, Blakely's beginner's mind practice. None of these are arbitrary. Every single one is a deliberate attempt to reach a specific cognitive state before the day demands their best thinking. The actions themselves are almost irrelevant. You could swap Buffett's reading for a slow walk. You could replace Dalio's meditation with 10 minutes of deep breathing. What matters? The thing that actually produces the cognitive advantage is the understanding that your mental state is the most valuable asset you manage. not your calendar, not your network, not your capital, your mind's capacity to think clearly, decide wisely, and perceive reality accurately. And the morning is the only window in the day when you have near total control over the inputs shaping that mental state. Once the day begins in earnest, once the emails arrive and the meetings start and the problems surface, you are responding, you are reactive. But from the moment you wake up until the world fully claims your attention, you have a window of cognitive sovereignty that most people immediately surrender to their phone, their anxiety, or their morning news. What you do in that window determines not just the quality of your day, but accumulated over years and decades, the quality of your mind, the clarity of your judgment, the range of your thinking, the depth of your perception. Here's the final pattern break that ties everything together. The morning routines billionaires don't talk about aren't secret because they're keeping them from you. They're secret because when you describe them honestly, I read slowly and let my brain wander, or I protect my mornings from any input that requires a decision, or I try to think like a child before I think like a CEO. They sound too simple, too unimpressive, too far from the hustle narrative that makes for a good magazine cover. The real competitive advantage in the morning isn't a cold shower or a gratitude journal or a 400 blender. It's understanding that your nervous system needs time each morning to reach its optimal operating state and ruthlessly protecting the conditions that allow that to happen. That's it. That's the whole thing. Warren Buffett sitting in his chair reading for 3 hours isn't discipline porn. It's a man who understood the economics of cognitive quality 40 years ago and has been compounding the return on that investment every single morning since. The question isn't what do billionaires do in the morning? The question is what kind of mind do they need to be? And what does the morning have to look like to build that mind every single day without exception? Most people optimize their morning for how much they get done. The ultra wealthy optimize it for who they become. And over time, those two strategies produce very different lives. Not because of luck, not because of privilege, but because of the invisible compound interest of a mind that's been carefully, deliberately, quietly prepared every morning to see what everyone else is too busy to notice.